Hello and welcome to Dinis Guarda, Cities ABC podcast YouTube series. We are a fast-growing series program that focuses on leadership and as well on profiling global leaders and inspiring people, both people from a lot of different industries, from a lot of different sectors, but people that want to change the world. And as well, they have a passion to show a more positive vision and a more, I would say, constructive as well narrative for our world. In this series, we highlight ideas, products, inventions, software, books, and organizations that reflect the multiple challenge opportunities we face in our cities and nations with the advent of Society 5.0, digital transformation, 4AR, AI, blockchain, and a lot of other terminology that is important for our world, but as well focus on sustainability and creating a more, I would say, more utopian vision of the world. I think we need ideas more than ever. So this is part of the program of citiesabc.com. That is a platform we created focused on cities, and as well is partly distributed in the openbusinesscouncil.org, Intelligent HQ, and fashionabc.org as well. That is a key for this interview. This series are distributed as well in all the major podcasts for the ones that have been listening, and we are very focused on profiling people that we respect and admire. On that note, I want to welcome Michael Stanley-Jones. Thank you so much for making it.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
I would welcome Michael Stanley-Jones. That is a unique personality, and Michael is difficult to define in a few words, and actually a lot of words are necessary. So I'll try to just highlight some of these achievements and some of the roles that he's been working. So Michael is American, based in Africa. As we speak, is right now in Czech Republic, and he serves in the United Nations Environment Program Ecosystem Integration Branch with the UNDP, UNEP, Poverty Environment Action for Sustainable Development Goals, based in Nairobi. He was an ongoing co-secretary and founder of the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, that is still involved as an ambassador, and has been an advocate for engagement with the textile and apparel industries on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And from 2009 to 2014, he served as a public information officer and press liaison with the Secretary of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, the three leading global treaties addressing hazardous chemical and wastes. So Michael has been serving as well in the UN Economical Commission for Europe in the Secretariat of the Convention to access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice, environment matters. So this is just some of the things. We have as well multiple other things he's been doing, both in the United Nations, but as well in the academia, where he's been having a lot of papers and research. He's been as well working with the Nube Environment Forum for Negotiation, where while in California, he developed the Silicon Valley, California Region Watershed Management Plan and historical pollution prevention plans for copper, nickel, and mercury contamination, which is in itself a lot of benchmarks and a lot of fantastic achievements. So as well, one thing that I want to highlight as well, Michael is a creative. He is as well, his passion includes stand-up comedy, nature and poetry, and he's been as well acting on these areas on the creative industries in Africa, especially in Nairobi, but a lot of other places. So Michael, thank you so much. It's great to have you here. I'll try to focus on this. I think we could continue, but I will just go this. So thank you for being here.
Well, you're very welcome. Yes, I couldn't have foreseen where I would end up. It's been a long and often very strange journey. I thought of myself as a community organizer. When the United Nations approached me and invited me to come to Geneva and to join the Secretariat of the Aarhus Convention to launch a clearinghouse, kind of web platform called the Aarhus Clearinghouse for Environmental Democracy, and to help implement, to bring into force a protocol to the Aarhus Convention, the Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision-Making and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters. The full title is 27 words long. It's easier to say Aarhus Convention. And that protocol was an outgrowth of a negotiation that I participated in as a community organizer in California for an international coalition, the International Campaign for Responsible Technology. And all of that grew out of my own experience living in Silicon Valley, growing up in the South Bay of San Francisco region during the dot-com boom. Prior to that, the high-tech industries moving in the 1960s, 1970s, and transforming what had been a fairly sleepy place, an agricultural center, into the high-tech mecca that it became. And that transformation also had a lot of good benefits, a lot of creativity, technology, a lot of knowledge was created, and a lot of wealth was created. But it had a dark side too, and the dark side included polluting the groundwater of the communities that I grew up in as a child. And so we became interested in how the industry needed to address the environmental consequences and work with us to ensure the safety and health of those resources in South San Francisco Bay Area. And that, what really struck me at the moment was I had known about these issues when I was a student, when I was an academic, when I taught public policy, environmental public policy at universities. And I had written and published papers about these kinds of issues, hazardous waste contamination, groundwater contamination, as an academic. But then I had a family, and I moved my children to schools and daycare centers, sitting exactly on top of what we in the United States call Superfund hazardous waste sites that I didn't know existed. I knew in general they existed other places, but I had no idea in Sunnyvale, California, Santa Clara, California, Palo Alto, California, San Jose, California, that there were this confluence of toxic Superfund sites that permeated the landscape. You can go there today. I can show you where the testing wells, the boreholes are for quarterly required tests of the contamination in the groundwater. And I, with all my knowledge and all of my, supposed wisdom, had forgotten to check my own backyard and to see if the kind of problems I'm writing about and publishing about could possibly affect my children. And sure enough, my children were very small children living on the land that had been contaminated and that was being systematically remediated, cleaned up slowly over decades. And that shocked me. So I became a parent, an outraged parent who wanted to exercise my right to know, my community's right to know about what kind of toxic chemicals were flowing in and out of our environment, which led me to work with instruments like the United States Toxic Release Inventory, which became a model for this very protocol, this international instrument called the Kiev Protocol on Pollutant Release and Transfer Registers to the Aarhus Convention. So it wasn't through my brilliant academic career or my planned scheme of professional development. It was just I was an angry parent who decided to use technology, the emerging technology of geographic information systems, to map these toxic hotspots, and then use other databases to show what kind of chemicals and what kind of chemical companies had produced them, and then use the internet to actually push this information out so everybody could learn what was flowing through their neighborhoods. The real emergence of GIS and internet came together with a third technology called the Google search engine. Google was invented during this time. And I brought these tools together and I brought them to the UN and I said, look, we can make this kind of information available globally. We now have the techniques, we now have the systems. And so that led to the adoption of the European Pollutant Release and Transfer Register. So European Union citizens now can look up this type of information. And it has been a force, I think, that, of all the work, it sounds so technical, but actually it's the one that touched my personal life the most, as I also had family members who died young of cancers mysteriously, not perhaps from those hotspots, but the whole issue of body burden, what's in our bodies, what kind of products do we use and touch, what kind of food are we ingesting, what is the chemical loading that we're giving ourselves and our children. So that was a parent's outrage that led me to become a global activist on right to know, and caught the attention eventually of the United Nations. They knew me a little bit before from some work I did on the Danube Convention with some community groups in Europe. But that was really separate. It was a different stream. I thought I was leaving the international stage, and I was going back to Silicon Valley, and I had a day job. I was sales and marketing specialist for a technology company, an absolutely normal kind of tech worker. And then, bam, reality woke me up. And then I thought, what could I really do to turn this around and give other parents the chance to protect their families and their communities?
Oh, that's very important and very inspiring, but as well quite radical, because you put your life on the serving all of these different things, which is not a simple task, and you went, I'm sure, for a lot of challenges. So before you go to a lot of the things around your career, so I would like to just touch, what was the moment that you made that decision, and as well, how did you start? How do you look at that moment, and how did you do it? Because I think it's very inspiring for the people listening to us.
I was invited with my wife, my then wife, Frances, and I were invited to the Alviso Water Festival. So Alviso is a community of 5,000-6,000 in those days, living at the north end of San Jose, California, on the waterfront of the lower South San Francisco Bay. And it was an agricultural community. About 80% of the population was Hispanic, living there and mostly working in the agricultural fields near Alviso. And the Water Festival gave us a chance to show on a laptop computer like the one I'm looking at now, on a geographic information system platform. My wife and I simply invited people to walk by a booth run by a local non-governmental organization. And we invited them to tell us their address, where they lived, and then we would type it into the machine. And the computer would spit out a map showing where there were hazardous facilities dealing with toxic chemicals in their neighborhoods. And that was really the wake-up call, because people were interested. They wanted to know, and they had no idea. They had no idea about the technology, but they had no idea about what was really going on in their neighborhoods. The thousands of tons of chemicals moving in and out of their environment. So that experience kind of made me decide I'm not going to stay solely as a high-tech salesperson. I'm actually going to join a movement to be part of a solution, this community right to know movement. So I moved over and became an advisor, a kind of consultant for a few months, and then eventually a staff member of a local non-governmental organization that was advocating for this type of information. I did a project called the Environmental Justice Mapping Project with a geographer, and we did it for the entire Silicon Valley region. I showed that at a benefit dinner gala that was attended by the mayor of the city of San Jose, and he walked up afterwards and he said, that map you showed in your presentation of that school, I went to that school when I was a kid. Okay, and so it really started to connect, the technology, the information, the theme connected with decision makers, and that just kept happening again and again and again. And eventually it was the Minister of Environment and International Development of Norway who had his blood taken and tested for persistent organic pollutants, toxic chemicals in his body burden. Because he had heard about this. He heard about it not from me, but heard about it from other community advocates in Europe who were running detox campaigns. And we kept building on that interest, just telling the story over and over and over again. That's also how I indirectly got involved in fashion, because some of those chemicals that we're worried about in the high-tech world are also part of the technologies that are used to make apparel, to dye fabric in particular. Persistent organic pollutants that are long-living, that bioaccumulate in organisms up the trophic levels, so that they concentrate, and they become ingested and embedded in our bodies for life, you cannot get rid of your toxic burden, your body burden, as we say. So that, that community experience led me to introduce technologies that were on the horizon in the 1990s, like GIS, like the beta version of Google before it was even final, the product. We discovered it and we tested it, we showed it to the World Health Organization. So, the UN is sometimes considered rather slow at adopting technologies, but before Google was out of beta, already WHO was seeing it applied for the fourth Environment and Health conference they held in London in 1999. So really, this was my journey. It wasn't planned. It wasn't forecast. I thought I was going to do ordinary business and be a family leader in my community where I already had grown up and had a lot of ties, and then tap on the shoulder, please come and give a talk at the World Summit on Information Society held in Geneva in 2003. And I showed up, and it was a secret plan to recruit me into the United Nations. So I was seduced to throw everything up in my home state. I didn't have to really convince, but we dialogued with my family on what it would mean if we moved to Europe again. We had some roots in Czech Republic prior to that, and then what if let's try this. Let's try to be good citizens, but do it inside the UN in this large organization with its own traditions, its own mores. California Bohemians meet United Nations Geneva. Oh my gosh, that's a culture clash. But it worked for me in that I've now had 17 years with the United Nations, and I've done, I think, some of the best work, but not exclusively the best work. I mean, some of the best work really was done in Silicon Valley, and it was done even earlier in Central Europe with other groups. So inside and outside, I think both pathways can lead to amazing results if you dedicate yourself to them.
No, that's very impressive, and I think it's. I love the way you put it, because I know that how difficult it is coming from a technology premium Silicon Valley world and then going to an institution as big and as sometimes very complicated to manage as the United Nations.
When I arrived in Geneva in January 2004, and I was given an email account, I was told, if you send an email, go to this big red binder, this big, Morocco covered book, open it up and write a line in it, who your email is to, who it's from, the date, the time, the subject, whether it was authorized, and then initial it. They actually, in 2004, still thought that email was like sending a registered letter. And that disappeared in the first year I was with the UN. It's entirely impractical and really not understanding how information is flowing today.
So I think, can you tell us about your work as a program office responsible for communications for the poverty, environment, and action on sustainable development goals on the UN precisely? Because that is one of the works you've been doing. And I would like, now that you spoke about UN, I'll pass that question for here. I think it's a very important thing. And as well, to demystify the work that the UN is doing, because I think now we have this kind of sometimes linear approach that the UN is not doing as much, but the UN is doing fantastic work. Like you said, research much before Google. And now Silicon Valley, ironically, you came from Silicon Valley that took over the world. And now you are trying to change from the UN, which is very inspiring as well. But I would like to hear your opinion about your work on that.
Yeah, I mean, the history of that goes back to something called Poverty Environment Initiative, which was a marriage of two programs. The United Nations Development Program had a program on poverty and environment, and the United Nations Environment Program launched a project on the same topic, poverty and environment. And two program officers put their heads together and they said, well, why don't we actually join forces and we'll have a joint project. In 2005, this was launched as the Poverty Environment Initiative. And what was different about that is that the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, has country offices with officers on the ground in hundreds plus countries, I mean, in most countries. And Poverty Environment Initiative leveraged those country resources on the ground and married them to United Nations Environment Program's global and regional presence. We don't have country presence, we don't have country offices, but we have normative, that is, we have knowledge that can guide policy, and we work with member states, usually through our regional offices, our regional programs, to help them implement reforms and policies. So we put brains and brawn together and married the two skill sets of our agencies and started working in eventually 28 countries when I joined in 2014, least developed countries and some middle-income countries that really had intractable problems with poverty that were driven by the poor or non-optimal management of natural resources. Most of the very poorest people in the world are heavily dependent on natural resources, natural capital, fisheries, forests, good farmland, water. They need natural resources to work for them because 70% of their livelihood might be drawn directly from nature. And that base, that natural capital, has been decaying, and it makes it really much harder to address the poverty that is underlying that relationship. So we went in with the idea that we could help governments up their game in environment and natural resource management, and do that with the UNDP country offices as our network on the ground. And then we added one other thing. Most environmental programs worked with ministries of environment and natural resources, which that seems obvious, but actual decision-making in government is kind of centered in a different place. Ministries of finance, ministries of planning, and the national executive, those are real centers of power. So we thought, well, let's do it differently. Let's embed in the Ministry of Finance, for example, our staff member that we'll pay, and they will be on the scene advising governments and helping them pull in the objectives of pro-poor, pro-environment policies that would work in tandem. We did this under the Millennium Development Goal Challenge, and which in 2015 then became the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So we've had two 15-year windows of achievement. We know we can get poverty down. We cut extreme poverty in half during the Millennium Development Goal period. And we wanted to completely eliminate extreme poverty under the new 2030 Agenda, which means by 2030, no poverty anywhere in any form of this most intractable extreme form. And that's really what our mission was. And I like that, because here we're going to integrate the best from development thinking and the best from the environment side of the equation, and use the two broad areas of knowledge to get governments to help governments make better decisions and better investments for eliminating poverty and protecting natural resources. That's where we started with the new project in 2018 called Poverty Environment Action for Sustainable Development Goals, which is a successor to Poverty Environment Initiative. And I was the knowledge manager and communications officer for Poverty Environment Initiative. I thought I would graduate and move out of that. But in fact, the Poverty Environment Action has faced strong challenges, strong headwinds, particularly now with coronavirus, and not being able actually to move people in and out of countries easily, not being able to convene the kind of sessions we had with stakeholders, with public interest groups, with investors, with government decision makers on the ground. Extremely challenging environment right now. So in this context, we decided to create a new ecosystems integration branch. It's the only new branch in all of UNEP, which pulls together the three major programs that have this kind of synthesis ethic, integrative ethic, pull together knowledge from different areas to make environment work for people and make natural resources, nature, a centerpiece of development strategy. And so Poverty Environment Action is one of those, but I also work with two other major programs, the Regional Seas Program, which covers the oceans, and Blue Economy, the benefits the oceans give to communities, to livelihood, and also with the International Ecosystems Management Partnership based in Beijing, which is a UNEP or partnership with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, as China has a strong record of eliminating extreme poverty. They've been growing well for several decades now, and poverty has been shrinking. So we wanted to make sure we harvest those lessons and help other countries that are struggling with that to also grow themselves out of poverty, but at the same time make resources more sustainable. And all of that in the context of the 2030 Agenda. So now I work for the branch. I don't work just for one project, and I'm trying to integrate things across the House so that we leave no one behind as this 2030 Agenda unfolds.
On that context of the 2030, and I think it would be good if you could just highlight for people that never heard about it, because I'm sure there's a lot of people that never heard about it if you are outside of the United Nations Sustainable Goals. Could you tell us about that? Highlight first of all the program, and I think because it's been, like you said, there was a massive benchmark. If you look at 1980, 1820, sorry, there was around 94% of poverty in the planet. Now we are in 2020, and we have around 10-11%. I think these are the numbers official. And I know that this was partly because of this work done by people like you around the world, and really a massive work that I think very few people give the credit. So I would like, and I know that the 2030 is part of that program, and it's been, of course, a much ambitious program. So if you could give a bit of a highlight that, and now you've been working on that.
You'll find nothing but, affection, admiration from me for the 2030 Agenda. It was adopted in 2015 as a successor to the 15-year Millennium Development Goals. And it was agreed by consensus by all member states of the United Nations. Now, think how fractious relations are sometimes between countries, and then compare that with all 193 countries of the UN system reaching agreement on 17 sustainable development goals, which are the structure of this 2030 Agenda, pledging in 15 years to try to hit those marks. They also agreed 169 targets for measuring the achievement of those goals. So it's kind of complex when you look at it, in that detailed light. But the takeaway is the entire globe agreed this is the blueprint, this is where we need to head. And to do that, the United Nations led a process that was unique in world history. We used ICT, we used communications technologies to reach out and engage with 3 million voices. 3 million, voices, people participated in hundreds of events to express what they wanted as the future of the planet. How to define these, what became 17 goals. And all of those voices had to be aggregated and respected in a process that led to something that all member states could agree on, which they did again in 2015. So, there's no other document in the history of the world that has this kind of force behind it, and that was created through such a participatory process. So you remember I mentioned I worked for this Aarhus Convention, which is public participation is at the heart of that. So I think of the process leading up to the adoption of the 2030 Agenda as one of the best examples of participatory democracy in the history of this planet. Now, are we achieving those goals? Not nearly as much as we had hoped. I mean, we are behind schedule with this year's, I would say, declining economic prospects. It's been all that much harder to make progress. So we and the Secretary General Guterres of the United Nations have repeatedly said we need to now redouble our efforts. So what are these goals? Well, I mentioned goal 1, which is to eliminate poverty. But other goals like goal 5 on gender equality, or goal 17 on innovative partnerships. I mean, different names for these goals, but they really link together. And that's kind of my special field, is working on issues where they cut across the agenda. One of them that I've worked on is equity, and gender rights. How do you mainstream considerations for the poor and for the equitable access to natural resources throughout goals that may be subject specific, goal 14 on life underwater, or, goals addressing climate change or air or land and so on. Those are all kind of specific, but permeating all of them should be this kind of constant concern for fairness, for equity, for gender equality. And so those cross-cutting issues are the ones that sometimes are forgotten in the first instance, because organizations, even UN organizations, often organize themselves in silos. Your unit works on this issue, your unit works on this issue. And the core of those issues are defined maybe in ways that are not so friendly for the horizontal connectivity between them. But we know, for example, in agriculture, from work we did with Poverty Environment Initiative, partnered with UN Women and the World Bank, we did some studies on agricultural productivity. And we just found that in sub-Saharan Africa, one of the biggest hindrances to upping productivity in agriculture was barriers that women face when they engage in agriculture and commerce. They don't have access to markets, they don't have access to technology, they don't have the same access to finance and so on. A lot of structural problems that were preventing women in women-led farms in the countries we studied from really reaching their potential. And we know we need to grow agriculture. We know we have a growing population. We have to feed more people, and we have to do it more efficiently and eco-efficiently, so we can continue to do it for the next generation and generations thereafter. So that kind of work is really the product of the 2030 agenda, to get people to see the environment and economy and equity in a holistic way, and to connect those dots. That's why I'm so passionate about that agenda, because there's no other instrument in the planet that has that scope and that holistic quality as the 2030 agenda.
To be honest, I think we should be very grateful. I think everyone in the planet. I know that at the moment we are in a moment that there's so much criticism for everything, but we have this fantastic achievement, and that is part that work. And I think everyone should be. One thing I've been more and more approaching, that's why I started as well this podcast and different platforms, is that we need to look at the facts. And of course there's always challenge, but the facts are facts. And you are a scientific person, so you know all that. So I just want to put a personal note on that, because I think we need to repeat it, especially if you see the news around us and all the fake things on that. So as part of the UNEP Sustainability Work Group, you support the developing of a lot of these programs. So I think just to understand, especially in the frameworks that you've been working, policies, you mentioned that before, how do you achieve this? And I think you mentioned the work with governments, and I know that is a very sensitive part of your work, but I know as well that it's probably one of the things we need to highlight more, and as well understand in order to demystify and probably get better results.
I've been using my creative community's persuasive powers. So you mentioned that I also like comedy and performing arts. We've actually brought some of those skills into the communication toolkit of the United Nations. Now decision makers don't really have time to read through tomes of thick 100-page reports. They need information that is grasped rapidly, that they can incorporate in their thinking, and they need it to be communicated in persuasive ways. So obvious tools, you've seen a switch from written reports to videography. We've moved from having side events at official UN summits, which used to consist of a panel of 7 or 8 experts or government leaders, so-called talking heads, who would each give a set speech, maybe with a PowerPoint behind them. And then there would be question, answer, and then perhaps for 5 minutes interaction with the audience. This format was repeated for decades, ever since PowerPoint was invented, I suppose. But it is stale, and it is not compelling for most people today. So instead, we started organizing events that would integrate visual displays, let's say photography, art, and even fashion. So at the 4th United Nations Environment Assembly, when we launched the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, which is just an interagency coordinating body. So it could be, rather ho-hum if you read it on paper. But during that launch, we interrupted the presentations by having fashion pop-ups, where sustainable designs made by some of the most creative artists that we could find were displayed. We didn't play music because we were still feeling rather solemn about the Ethiopian air disaster that happened on the eve of the 4th United Nations Environment Assembly. So we didn't have catwalks and flashing lights or anything like that. But we actually showed the material of sustainability. We showed ideas of design, and we backed that with a Sustainable Innovations Expo, where we invited 50 businesses and entrepreneurs to come and have booths and display their innovations. Some of which, like blockchain, are more intellectual, but others, like turning water hyacinth, a water pollutant in Africa, into a fabric that could be durable and beautiful, were also inspiring. And those kinds of events where you mix media, you mix the creative force behind them with and mingle that into the dialogue with government decision makers. Not just presenting them with information, but giving them the textuality of communication today. And young people in particular, they're using the internet in ways that we didn't imagine back in 1980s and 90s when we were inventing these tools. Their creativity is beyond our imagination, and that evolution will continue. So to answer the question shortly, governments need to be exposed to the new ways that people communicate. Art is fantastic because it transcends borders. You don't need an interpreter or a translator for an image to impact someone in a community, even if they don't speak the same language as the community that produced it. So it's a new way of communicating that I think we need. It means practically we're also using big data a lot more. We're doing a lot more mapping. We're doing a lot more of infographics as a communications tool. For the 3rd United Nations Environment Assembly, I created 2 long roll-ups and just moved them around the halls so people could read the story, see the pictures, and understand, what does it really mean to address poverty, environment, and equity in one package, with waste picking community in Peru, or with women vendors in Rwanda. These are stories and storytelling that can motivate us far beyond what the dry data sometimes tells us.
No, that's amazing, and I'm completely subscribed that, and I think we need that more and more. So I think on that level, I would like to ask about, of course, one of the biggest things you've been involved in is UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. So how did you get engaged? How did you been creating this? Because it's been having a massive effect worldwide, and I know that even from a branding end, you're talking about art and creativity, but it's actually touching a lot of things, and as well as creating a conscious level for the fashion industry, but as well for the community. Because I think after the UN Sustainable Fashion initiative, it created much more awareness for all the industry. And of course, COVID is right now highlighting all of this. But I would like to hear how it started, your engagement, what are the goals right now?
I have to give credit to 3 women-led community-based organizations in Kenya, because they came to me and they said, how can we be involved in the 2030 agenda for sustainable development? And I mentioned that we had an upcoming assembly of the United Nations Environment Community, the UNEA 2, and they conceived of having a fashion event at UNEA 2. So I didn't come with the idea of fashion. They working in rural Kenyan communities with women, with agriculture, with development issues that they were addressing, things like HIV/AIDS. They wanted to bring their stories and share them with the community brought together by UNEA 2, this assembly. And so we decided we would have a dinner discussion that would be punctuated with fashion show, and then supported by artisans from the informal settlements around Nairobi, where they could, actually vend their crafts. We didn't do it at the UN. It's a little bit restricted there, but we did it in Westlands outside of the UN, and we announced it during the meeting on the eve of the opening of the meeting on a Saturday evening, and 100 people got in taxis and cars. Unfortunately, the bus system isn't the easiest to navigate in Nairobi, and they came to this dinner, which was an outdoor garden dinner, and each of these women leaders from their communities told their story. And I emceed the event. I helped produce it and introduce them, but I had no hand in scripting anything. Their stories were so authentic and so compelling, people had tears in their eyes and rushed afterwards to see how they could be engaged and support their what they're called CBOs, community-based organizations. We also had Jacqueline McGlade, who is UNEP's chief scientist, who also is an advocate for sustainability in the Maasai community. She's a Maasai. I think she was a princess at that time. She was married to a Maasai prince, and she came in her Maasai costume and talked about the development she's worked on to bring sustainability really down to the community level. That event so impressed people that it led to this dialogue. And when other UN agencies asked UNEP, would you like to join us in creating what became the Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, I was asked if I could speak on behalf of UNEP. People remembering my engagement with a fashion benefit dinner. It was as simple as that. Of course, I had long been watching this community develop and thinking about how fashion and sustainability could support the 2030 agenda. But I didn't initially come with the ideas, fashion bad, toxic, wasteful. I didn't see the dimensions challenge that the apparel and textile sector face at that time. At that time, I thought, fashion is popular and it's ubiquitous. Everybody loves to dress. Everybody has their style, and it doesn't matter where you are on the planet, whether it's a rural community or a montane community. You have traditions, folk traditions, you have local style, and you have youth mobilized and engaged around this topic. So I thought, wow, fashion, this could be a way of drawing people in and introducing them to the 2030 agenda. So that was initially my hopeful sign. Talking to my colleagues, my environmentalists, friends, I was really shocked to find out the animosity that was held against this industry because of its dismal performance against any measure of sustainability. Even the industry's own metrics give it extremely low scores. 0 to 100, they're scoring less than 50. Almost all of the major companies and brands are doing less than they need to do to be able to claim they're sustainable. So 10 UN agencies met in New York and agreed to create this alliance in July 2018. They invited me to be the organizer of it, the secretary, inaugural secretary. We convened a meeting in Belgrade in December. The executive director of UNEP issued an invitation to all UN agencies and specialized agencies. So everything from Global Compact to the World Bank to UNCTAD, the Trade and Development Commission, International Labor Organization, UNEP, United Nations Development Program. I could go on. It's a long list. And some friends like Food and Agriculture Organization that also is working in the field on sustainable fashion from from agricultural products. So there was, such interest, and we pulled this together. We adopted our first work plan on the eve of the formal launch in March of 2019. And there, the Alliance's real objectives come to the fore. We're not just about publicizing the issue. Our audience, first and foremost, are member states themselves, because government has been a bit late coming to this agenda. They haven't, they haven't been the strongest voices in leading the sustainable fashion movement. That's probably more coming from industry itself and the advocacy community that's, driving concerns of consumers about the unsustainability and the poor performance. So companies are leading, environmental organizations are leading, research and development is advancing, technology is advancing, and governments need now to step up and express their own leadership to bring this movement to fruition, to make its impact really more powerful. So we are collaborating across the UN system so we can pull our strengths together and present to our members, our member states, to the diplomatic community, the best products that we've found. An example I mentioned earlier was the Sustainable Innovation Expo, where we had 50 entrepreneurs showcasing these innovations. Also dialogue on circularity and textiles. And we've done that not just for the environmental community. We've done it in New York with the General Assembly. We've done it with the International Trade Center and their International Trade Center's public forum last year, where circularity and textiles was on the agenda again as the main theme. And we'll continue to do it with UNCTAD next year, Creative Cities Network, UNESCO. We just keep banging away so that governments will learn where the issue stands. But beyond that, we are systematically mapping the value chain and looking at strategic points where we can tip processes. I'll give an example. There's a great concern now about fashion waste, with fast fashion producing clothes that are worn on average 7 times and then tossed in the bin, with 80% of fashion being incinerated, unsold clothing being incinerated, and only 20% landfilled, end of life. I mean, it is really a ticking time bomb, and that's unacceptable. It's a waste of natural resources, a waste of natural capital. It's a business model that cannot enable us to achieve the 2030 agenda. Just on one metric alone, the carbon footprint, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with fashion and apparel, footwear and leather goods, I mean, we're talking upwards of 10% of global emissions. Just, footwear, tennis shoes alone, 1.4% of the global carbon footprint. Those figures are skyrocketing. They're until COVID, those were growing much faster, such that Ellen MacArthur Foundation predicted they'd become 1/4 of the global footprint by 2030. That's wholly unacceptable in a world that's supposed to be headed towards carbon neutrality, to stop the climate emergency and to keep global temperatures under 1.5 degrees Celsius average increase by 2050. You have to make enormous progress to cut your carbon now. And if fashion doesn't know how to do that, then we have a responsibility to help fashion find a way. And so we have been promoting tools like the Science-Based Carbon Initiative, which supports the Paris Agreement, which is the agreement to cut global carbon emissions by 2050. And these tools help companies audit their value chain, figure out where they can make the greatest reductions the most quickly and efficiently. We know we can cut global carbon budget by half by 2030 with tools that we already have, but companies need access to them. They need to know, and governments need to know that these companies need to know and can make these changes successfully if they get that access. So, very practical steps. Mention one last one, and that's we have a project with the International Trade Center called Reset. And that project is to look at all those norms and standards and tools that are existing out there, and then package them in a way that a CEO can apply them at company level, at brand level, and make those changes rapidly. We don't have a lot of time. 2030 is right around the corner, but we have to do it if we're going to achieve what we've set out to do.
Yeah, and I think it's a massive requirement. And I think one question, just to wrap up with this, being all your experience in Silicon Valley, with initially what made you look at this, and as well now with the fashion industry that you went deep, and as well all the work in the United Nations, what would be like the top problems that we need to solve? Because when you talk about climate change, there's so much counter-information right now that it becomes a completely nightmare from people right now attacking the 5G and all this kind of thing. So there's a lot of craziness around this. So from a scientific background and as well leading one of the biggest organizations in the world in this area, or the biggest, how do you look at the major problems that we can tackle right now, and especially the things you mentioned fashion in general in terms of sustainability?
I would start with our habits of consumption and production, which of course fashion is, deeply embedded in our economies. Fashion produces around $2.5 trillion of value each year. So it is a major portion of our economy. And in Africa, the creative economy is forecast to grow to be the second most important economic activity after agriculture for Africa's economies. So that gives you a sense that we're not talking about just things that are not central to our livelihoods and our sustainable agenda. These are absolutely core products that are flowing in and out of our lives that we have to get our arms around if we're going to be successful. And they are huge economic drivers of economies in the developing world and in the developed world. So what kinds of measures can we take? We will issue very shortly a new report on circularity in textiles, circularity and sustainability of the textile value chain. Textiles being, of course, what feeds our clothing industries. And circularity means, among other things, closing the loop. So the products, the commodities we take and use to make the products at their end of life or near end of life should not be thrown into the ecosphere, but should be recovered and repurposed, reused, recycled, reconfigured, redesigned. We need to value the material world in a different way. And consumers have a role in that, but so do producers, because producers can choose materials that lend themselves to circularity. So I'll give an example, and I don't want to just be up on one sector, but about 2/3 of fabric in the world today is made of polyester, and polyester is a derivative of petroleum. It is plastic, if you will. And plastic pollution is an enormous problem of our oceans, problem of our seafood, problem of the air column, as microfibers from plastic, largely from clothing, I think, are floating in the airshed, and we are inhaling them. Plastic itself may not be super toxic, but it often attaches toxins to it, like pesticides or persistent organic pollutants, oil droplets, and so on. The plastic acts at the microscopic level like a sponge. Okay, so, well, maybe we need to reconsider what we use to weave fabric. Maybe polyesters might not be the optimal, material, because it turns into a pollutant too rapidly, and we have not figured out how to capture and control it yet, which is why we have a process looking at marine litter and microplastic pollution right now, which is a global issue, because all of our seas are now littered and polluted by plastic. So what could we do better? We could look at materials to see if they are eco-sensitive, if they are sustainable, if they biodegrade in the ecosphere when they're released to the environment and become harmless, or whether they, like plastics, might live for 200 years before they decay and break up. And even when they break up, what's their fate in transport? Are they like microfibers floating through the airshed? Are each of us inhaling more than 80,000 microfibers, micron-sized filaments of plastic into our lungs? Is that what the future we want for the planet? Because that future is already here. We just don't know what it means. But we do know that we can also lower our carbon footprint. If we extend the life of our clothes, if we pick more durable fabrics, if we don't wear something once or twice and then throw it in the waste bin, where it can become incinerated and turn into a dioxin, another persistent organic pollutant that floats through the airshed and is landing on our ecosystems and contaminating, for example, marine animals, marine life, with very high levels of POPs, persistent organic pollutants, found in sea lions, for example. There's a conscionable way we can consume, where we look at the life cycle of these products and we choose those that are more ecologically sensitive, better for our health, better for the planet's health, and use less petroleum, that are free of our addiction to oil and gas, which is not helping the climate emergency cut its carbon loading. So those are just a few ideas: circularity, recycling, designing for the environment, and other steps we can make, both as producers and consumers, that would change the equation and head us in the right direction.
Oh, amazing. And a lot of the notes, we are taking notes here because there's a lot of good things that I think we should speak loud about that. So I want to touch one thing that relates with that, and there's a work that you wrote, that is Reward and Renewal, the Poverty Environment Initiative Final Project Report, that you are a co-author with G. Gupta and different things. And you have as well Remanaging the Driver Pressure State Impact Response Framework from an Equity and Inclusive Development Perspective. Do you want to talk about this? I think this is particularly interesting. There are two different things, but are very important.
Reward and Renewal is a product summing up 5 years of our work, the United Nations Development Program and United Nations Environment Program. And the important part of that report is not just the report to our constituents on the success, on the achievements of those projects, those 28 country projects, but also the lessons that we learn from them. Rules of the road and ways governments can do things better, which we're now again applying in the next project, Poverty Environment Action. But they're not just for us. They're really for any agency, any bilateral donor, any development group can read that report and digest. Look at those lessons. We have a couple, 3, 4 publications that have tried to summarize at different levels the lessons learned. There's one for Africa, there's one for Latin America and Caribbean, where we had worked with Poverty Environment Initiative. There's another one for Central Asia. And then there's 2 global reports, Reward and Renewal being one of the 2, the final project report. The other paper on equity, which is an examination of the way that we have evaluated global environmental problems, a methodology that was applied by the Global Environment Outlook. That's a report, but it's also a process by which the United Nations Environment Program engages with governments around the world and really maps out the key environmental issues and challenges that we face, and then also looks at solutions. So that process resulted in the publication in 2019 of the Global Environment Outlook 6 report. Professor Gupta was the co-chair of that process, which involved over 200 experts nominated by governments, by member states, and that was supported by my secretariat. I was asked to be an advisor on the cross-cutting issue of equity, and we eventually worked very closely with the gender work group, which was our authors team that looked at gender as a cross-cutting issue. So the two went hand in hand. And we went through that exercise for 2 years, dialoguing with the other experts and with authors who were tasked by that process to draft the first conclusions and the evidence. And that led to this massive study, which is available. It's online at unenvironment.org, GEO6. But also there's a lot of spun off products of that, GEO for youth, the GEO for business, and so on. That kind of made it more accessible because it is a scientific tomb. And parallel to that, a group of us drafted a paper, if you will, published in a reputable peer-reviewed journal, which addressed the equity dimension, basically making the argument that many environmental issues, when you do not look at the distributional impacts across populations, how they affect the poor and the marginal in different ways than they affect the average community, you can miss an important parameter, which is essentially an argument being made since at least 1990 by the environmental justice community in South Africa, in the United States, and in Europe, but in other places as well, in Indonesia. You really need to look if your policies are treating the most disadvantaged fairly. Now, that at one time may have seemed a bit radical because classical economists thought, development economists thought, the way to help people is just to grow economies. And they were measuring things at the aggregate level as, what's the country's gross domestic product? Is it going up? Is it going up by so much? And they didn't really look carefully to see, does increasing prosperity, for example, in the capital or in the urban center, does it translate into increasing prosperity for women in rural communities, for example? And the answer often is it doesn't. We can see increasing wealth, but going hand in hand with increasing inequality. Now it's a commonplace. Inequality is a drag on development. Inequality is not only just inherently unfair, but actually slows down a country's move to exit the poverty trap. So now we're a bit more mature, I think, and we reflected this in the GEO6 with a cross-cutting issue of equity. I forget, equity now appears something like 65 times in at least the draft report. And what we tried to do in our research was really to document how across a number of examples this equity issue changes the way we would look at the pressure state response model that had been a framework for doing this kind of analysis. This is a mandate of the United Nations Environment Program given to us by the General Assembly. We are the stewards of the scientific evidence-based work on the state of the environment globally, and it is as close as we have to a global state of the environment report, the global environment outlook.
Amazing, and I think this is kind of I think it's one of the major issues, the idea how can we improve these areas of reward and renewal and all the different areas that have been touching, because we have a very schizophrenic world with a lot of different divisions. But well, let's continue on the section. I'm trying to wrap up. I know that's probably a bit tired, but I think I wanted still 3 questions more.
Oh, I never get tired. You should know that about me by now.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I may become boring, but I really...
No, not boring at all. No, this is amazing. I think we should...
I get paid by the word, so the more I speak...
the better.
Yeah.
No, your words are very precious. So I want to ask, probably on the personal level, but as well on the professional, how did you end up in Nairobi? And you mentioned that you start the UN Sustainable Goals based there, but as well, you've been very active in Kenya, in Africa, but you've been living there. So yeah. I know that Africa is going to be the future continent, as most of the people are 20 years old. So you've been there on the epicenter of a lot of things. And as well, a very dynamic culture, but very complex as well. So a bit of that base, how did you end up there and all the things related?
I'm going to get in trouble with my friends in Geneva, because there I was, based since 2004 until 2014. I had my 10th year there, and Geneva's it's a pretty nice place in many regards, but I felt that as a UN officer, as a UN person, I needed a rounder experience. I needed to not be in a highly developed commercial environment, but I needed to be in a more pluralistic, more diverse, and more challenging environment. And most UN officers at one point or another in their careers, they go into the field. Nairobi is still a headquarters. It's the headquarters of UN Habitat and UN Environment Program. And it's a very cosmopolitan and vibrant city, not perhaps the typical city in Africa, but hugely interesting one. I had visited it. I had been approached and asked if I wanted to work there. But at the same time, my wife was a zoographer. She was documenting the lives of animals in zoos, and also the trade in export of wild animals from Africa to Europe, which is a very kind of critical history, critical in the sense that it's not always a happy story. It's often a very tragic story. For every gorilla, chimp taken from the African wilds, perhaps 10 other chimps have died in that trade and trafficking. And she was supporting a project at Prague Zoological Garden to raise funds for eco guards in Senegal, I believe. Maybe Cameroon. Not my detail, not my expertise. But the point was, she had long wanted to move to Africa and be in direct contact with the issues that she cared about, that we all should care about, of wildlife conservation. And so we both had this kind of, opportunity to come. We came to Nairobi. She very quickly joined a leading non-governmental organization that works on interdiction of wildlife trafficking, of the smuggling and of the syndicates that organize the movement of animals and animal parts, including rhino horn and pangolin skin, and sometimes, shockingly, also body parts of humans that these criminal organizations trade in from Africa. So they have an 8-country network, and they've worked closely with customs and with police and with the Ministry of Environment and with Interpol to help to help capture and document the evidence of these crimes and put down these syndicates. So she has her own agenda, hugely important one, and I support it. And we have been now 6 years working on I work on poverty and environment. She works on wildlife conservation using these different tools and networks. Beyond that, I just fell in love with Kenya and with East Africa. Nairobi is an exciting place. Nature is not the only attractive thing about Africa. I think we have a bit of a romanticized view. This is a very urban place that we live. It has a dynamic culture. It has some of the friendliest people. Sorry, Switzerland, but the charm offensive goes to Kenya, because these are some of the warmest human beings you'll find on the planet. And I come from Northern California. We're not known for being too grumpy. We're not from Minnesota, for example. Sorry, Minnesota. But Northern California is sometimes considered a fairly laid-back place. I think that's probably only partly true. Today, with the fires, it's a very tense and a tragic place as well. But we're not known for being cold. Wow, we are beaten hands down by East Africa. Warm, friendly, and creative people. It's been great also, having come from Silicon Valley, to see that now Kenya is making huge advances in applying ICT, in applying the high-tech tools and telephony in particular, and e-finance, other ways. This is a place to watch, because it's going to transform probably how I do my banking in the very near future.
I think as the last probably 2 questions, but I probably will get a third one. But I want to talk about, so we are in very special times, but very comprehensive and very difficult times as well. So in one end, we have COVID-19. In one end, we have the acceleration of digital transformation, that a lot of things that will take probably decades will be done faster because people have to do it. And a lot of governments are accelerating that. And you touch digital transformation in what you're saying. But we have as well a very strong perception of the reality with a lot of cynicism, fake news, and a lot of different things. So I know that the United Nations has been working on the Sustainable Development Goals. You mentioned the 2030 Agency. And I think that work is more important than ever, especially with the concept of Society 5.0. That initially was created by the Japanese government, and I know that the United Nations has been working on that as well. You mentioned the circular economy. So in terms of messaging of hope, and I think all your discourse is about that, but I would like to highlight, especially for the young generation and as well for the individuals and organizations that are going through a lot of serious moments, especially right now. What would be your message? I know that you are a very person of hope and initiative as well.
I think I'm going back to my roots and the way where we started, and that is at the United Nations Environment Program. We are developing a new sub-program. We organize our work and many of our divisions according to these sub-programs like environmental governance, which is led by our law division, or ecosystems health, which is led by our ecosystems division. But the newest one of this cluster is digital transformation. So that's the future. That includes cooperating with our science division on big data, on Earth observation, and on finding new ways of capturing and communicating the environmental situation and the solutions that are out there for it. So digital is coming again on strongly within the UN system. So how does that provide opportunities for youth and for people entering the workforce, entering the marketplace? Under COVID, we saw that digital commerce is in strong demand. Fashion companies that had no online presence have really suffered, and some of them have even gone out of business. Others who already had developed digital services, e-commerce services, and it's not just about shopping online. I have to say, this is not, Amazon 3.0 is something like that. This is also about procurement. It's also about design and production upon demand. It's also about 3D printing and other techniques that are coming online that will marry internet tools with how we produce and consume our products. So pairing that to the old model of big box retail is probably the future. We will see a pluralization of the sources of products. So value chains are pluralizing. They'll be shorter, from the market to the factory to the consumer household. That will be a shorter line than the global value chain that we've grown up around during the last quarter century or more. And there will be more opportunities at different points to apply these digital reforms. So coming up to speed on things like blockchain, on digital design, coming up to speed on how to market effectively and communicate over the internet. Digitalization, full cart, that's probably the future. And that will radically change the labor force. Because, for example, we won't overproduce as we have been, and then have to warehouse and then eventually toss away and incinerate excess stock, clothes that were never wanted, that were never successfully marketed and sold, pure wastage. We're going to squeeze all of that inefficiency out of the market, and the digital is one of the main tools we have for doing that. I also think that more broadly, creative economy, it's not just about the application of these ICT reforms. It's also about bringing creativity back up where it kind of gets the full respect and the weight that it has in our national economies, in our labor forces. So performing arts, probably much greater role in our future. Storytelling, much greater role. When I was an undergraduate, my father was very worried if I took a class in folklore or poetry. Alarmed, why aren't you studying engineering? Well, look at today. Those who know how to communicate, those who can tell stories, those who can write music, those who can produce graphic arts, those who can digitize those skill sets and marry them to ICT, those are the superstars. Those are our new sports heroes today. It's really a changed landscape. I'm really pleased my children decided to study art, and for one of them, ancient history, because somehow ancient history is going to come back and bite us again. And will come back into vogue when it's married to the new technologies and new skills that will be demanded by the marketplace of the 21st century. So I advise individuals, I mentor quite a few of them, particularly in the spoken word community in Nairobi, in the performing arts, but also governments and government decision makers. Let's invest in this. Let's figure out how we can create opportunities and new markets, and they are coming. I'll just mention one that maybe hasn't gotten the attention it needs, but there's a huge boom in online gaming. But who knew that online gaming has spawned a boom in digital fashion, where consumers are going online and they're buying costumes, bespoke made clothing for their characters and dressing them up, and then having them move through the virtual world, doing their adventures really well dressed. Now, that may seem exotic and bizarre to those of us who are, my age. Look at this beard. But honestly, to a consumer who's 30 and under, that's the future. I saw some statistics where the average shopper for virtual digital fashion was spending annually $58 a year, and that's expected to explode, to become a $150 million market in the next year. So, there are opportunities if you use your imagination. I might not have thought of that, but certainly creative people are thinking of it, and they're designing for the future right now.
Yeah, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, all the virtual goods and virtual design and things like that. So on that note, I want to ask you one question, because you have, first of all, you have a big, like you mentioned, sensitivity for the arts. And although coming from an engineer and technology background, you're writing poetry and you're doing stand-up performance and using that as well part of your work and communications. And if you look at Nelson Mandela, he actually managed to unite South Africa partly because of the sports and the music as well. So it worked in a country very divided, especially after apartheid. So one of the questions is I would like to touch a bit of this creative industries work that you've been doing, because I think it's very important. I think, like you said, there's there's a huge divorce between, I had as well a background of arts and literature. So in my case, it's natural, but I came to technology, and I kind of, when I speak in technology people about art and poetry, I have to be very careful. Not everyone understands. So speaking with you, I feel at home. But one of the things I find is really that we have the architects and the engineers. And this is creating a massive, and then of course you have then the storytellers, and you have good storytellers and bad storytellers. But the engineers are taking over the world, especially Silicon Valley, where you start your career, and they control a huge part of the world. And right now China is taking the other part of the world. And actually, Eric Schmidt recently mentioned in a panel that China is right now a decade ahead of the rest of the world in terms of technology. And like you mentioned, just 10 years ago, they were under massive poverty. So one of the things I would like to touch is the geopolitics of these things. And you touch digital transformation. And digital transformation comes with data. And data is the biggest asset of our times, and especially the way we deal with data. But there's a lack of understanding about this, especially by governments, which is kind of alarming. But at the same time, you mentioned blockchain, AI, which are the biggest technologies, and they are going to be, and I'm working in blockchain and AI, I'm building this technology myself, and I feel that what I can do scares me. And I have kind of good principles, at least I think I have, and I work for that. but not everyone has. So how do you cope with that, especially the UN? I think the UN has been working a lot in terms of mostly the circular economy and the agenda 2030, but on the data ownership and the data ethics. I would like to touch that because it's critical, even for fashion industry, because the IP and all these different areas, everything touches this. So I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, it comes close to my origin with the being recruited at the World Summit on the Information Society in 2003 to the UN. Just recently I looked at UN CFACT, which is the Center for Trade Facilitation and E-Business, which is a specialized agency mandated by the Economic and Social Council of the UN, but hosted by the Economic Commission for Europe in Geneva. And CFACT has just published two important papers. When COVID broke out, excuse me, they did a survey and they studied how this would impact commerce globally, and then drew recommendations on how e-commerce could be used to promote trade under the conditions that markets suffer from today. One of their main recommendations was that we need to apply blockchain. And so there's a second paper that's exclusively an introduction to blockchain and discusses, what benefits it could bring to commerce globally. And the thing about blockchain that I take away from glancing, looking at this debate and looking at the article, is blockchain is a powerful tool for accountability and for transparency. So when you talk about, the problems of data ownership or kind of creeping monopolization of information, maybe we don't need to point fingers. We probably know that debate. I certainly don't think anyone is taking over the world. I think the world can't be taken over. It belongs to us in common.
I believe.
Yeah, but all of that said, blockchain is a technology with tremendous potential for authenticating information in the public sphere, so that it cannot be held as proprietary information. And I've seen this over and over again with the history of technology and information and communication technologies, where things that we thought were impossible because they were proprietary became the norm. I'll give an example. Before Google search engine was launched, when we were all still using Alta Vista or other platforms, in Commonwealth countries of the world, there was a standard that if you wanted to look at information in somebody's website, you had to go through the homepage. You had to land where they told you to land, and then you could drill down. But I was authoritatively told in 2000, the year 2000, that you cannot copy a URL from a subpage of a website because that was proprietary, or whatever the equivalent is in Commonwealth law. That's just amazing, because most of the data and information that's interesting is embedded below the home page of a website. So it's a little bit like my story of having to log by hand manually emails that were sent from the Economic Commission from Europe prior to 2004. This is just, this was not a practical standard. And the technology has accelerated to the point where controlling information in that way just doesn't work. And so same with blockchain. I don't think blockchain is going to lead to a consolidation. I think it's going to free information. Now, I'm not the expert on blockchain, but CFACT is working with agencies like International Trade Center, World Trade Organization, and the Economic Commission for Europe. So these three intergovernmental UN agencies to help businesses figure out how they can move and apply these tools in ways that will both support their business plan, but at the same time also make them more accountable to consumers and to decision makers who are trying to protect our planet. So there's sliver of hope. I hope I hit it on the head. I'm glad to hear you're working in blockchain. I hope I'll be doing some things in that in the future, because I can also see its application to sustainable fashion, where we can tag products and track their origin, their ethical production, their materiality, so we know that they've got the right stuff in them and nothing dangerous that we wouldn't want to recover and reuse again because of its toxicity, for example.
I will finish with the last question that is about your poetry and about your stand-up work, because I'm very, I think it's very important to finish with a moment of ideas.
Yeah.
And I think, like you mentioned, that has been very important for your work, and especially as an engineer, I'm very excited about that. I don't know if you want to talk about this.
Okay, well, I forgot to add that your comment about engineers taking over the world. I mean, it's really the children of engineers who will take over the world, and they turn out to be poets. I'm an example. My father was a systems engineer. He worked on the Apollo space program, where engineering is extremely critical to the system. But I didn't turn out that way, and I think we're in safe hands with the next generation. About the poetry, I mean, like most of the things I've done and described, it didn't come through any deliberative, training or process. I did study literature when I was an undergraduate for a time. I studied art a little bit, although I trained in political science, social science. But it came about because we had a rough patch in our lives, in my family, with serious illness. I won't go into that. But being a middle-aged man, I kind of faced a choice. I could despair and maybe engage in some bad habits that middle-aged men sometimes do when they despair. Overeat, under-exercise, lose sleep, and maybe do other things that are bad for your health. And instead, I decided I would write. I would try to write lyric poems, to cheer myself up in a sense, or to distract myself, or give myself some creative outlet for expression that would help me get through what was a really difficult year, when things were hanging in the balance. And so I gave myself a challenge. This is kind of my training as a reporting officer at the UN. I decided that I would give myself the challenge to write 100 poems in 1,000 days. That was how I put it. And that's about one poem every 10 days. I don't do the math. I'm probably wrong about that. But, it pressured me to try to, have an output that I could see headed towards this very artificial goal of 1,000 poems. Now, that actually worked. I mean, I'm just such a nerd that I liked having that benchmark to measure my progress. And so I started writing poem after poem after poem. And of course, I began to read them to friends. And the friends would, sometimes be at a meeting, in a break between meetings. So it was at some UN events. So I was reading poems in Bangkok and Jakarta and New York City, at different venues. We used to have a lot more meetings than we have today, but I also was invited to do open mic performance before a comedy troupe gave a performance at a local coffee house. So I used to hang out and write some of these poems at a coffee house. Isn't that very bohemian of me? I'm here in South Bohemia, so I'm permitted to be bohemian. And the manager of the coffee house said, well, Mike, would you, my name is Michael, Mike, would you like to perform during open mic? And so I got up one evening in front of a crowd and I said, my name is open mic, my name is Mike and I'm open to poetry. And I read a poem. And that led to a couple more invitations to read at Karua Comedy Club. And I met these stand-up comedians who were pioneering English language stand-up comedy. So that led eventually to me helping them with the launch of the first International Nairobi Comedy Festival, which was held at Kenyan National Theatre last December. And we were preparing the second Nairobi International Comedy Festival. I performed for the first time in a comedy skit. I'm a stand-up bureaucrat, so I thought that was appropriate. And it got a few laughs. And basically, I like to write, so I do write jokes for some comedians who are friends, who are professional performers, much funnier than I am. But they're appreciative. And that's off to the races. We're trying to keep the English language comedy circuit going in East Africa, because I think that's part of the creative economy, and it will be a successful crossover product or export, if you will, to South Africa, to UK, to Netherlands, to Canada, USA, hopefully someday. So that's the inspiration for comedy. On the poetry side, it just got weirder and weirder, because I kept getting invitations to go to these, events, poetry slams, and weekends, 6-7 hour long events with 50 different youth, age 15 to age 28, mainly doing weird stuff. I don't know anything about rap or spoken word, and I'm sitting there with a poem in my hand, reading each word and punctuating, writing like it's the 18th century. And they were amazed. They were so open to it. It's like, wow, they never thought that you could write a sonnet. And okay, well, that's, I guess, what I do. It's been described as vintage poetry. And I was invited to be on Kenyan television and read a couple poems there. And then I was, parking my car one day, and the guards from the parking lot came up and they shook my hand, and they were so glad to hear this poetry. That's just amazing. So we have poetry coffee breaks at UNEP. 1 minute, instead of having a cup of joe, just take a break from what you're doing and listen to a poem. It only takes 1 minute to listen to a poem, and it can really change your day. So that's me. I now do public performances upon demand. I'm writing poems when people want to retire, or they want to have a baby, or maybe they had a baby, or maybe they shouldn't have had a baby. But we do it upon demand, because if you can write poems, don't keep it to yourself. It's not me. It's for them.
Oh, that's wonderful. It reminds me what happened with I correspond a lot on that, but it's very inspiring. And then, is there any place where we can actually find these poems?
No place. No. I mean, I did share a few of them on Facebook and on LinkedIn, but I have a book in the works. I'm looking for an illustrator, because I think, like Lewis Carroll, these would probably go down better if they had pictures with them. As a friend of mine said, when I gave him a book that had no pictures, he said, "What? No pictures?" So all right, we live in an anime world. Let's illustrate some of the poems. Some of the allegorical poems, I think, would be really freshened by some good pen drawings. And I've been talking to a couple publishers. I think a nice slim volume that can disappear quickly in the ecosphere. Not too many printed copies. Let's make an electronic publication. That would be more digital, wouldn't it? But that's in the plans for next year. I've got, I don't know, out of that 100 poems I was going to write, I threw away about 50. Another 20 or 25 are just bad. But that's okay. You need to write to hit your mark. And there's 3 or 4 that I absolutely love, and I really hope I could share them. And then I can buff the book out with a few of those middle products, those developmental poems, showing that I'm learning my craft. But it's been a lot of fun, and I really love reading and reading aloud. I think performing poetry is, it's an underrated skill to be a voice artist. I think that we should give more respect to that. So I will make an audio recording of my favorite 10 or 12 poems and try to get that out next year online. And you're welcome to steal any of my lines. Poets are famous for plagiarizing each other. I even, deliberately sometimes plagiarize other poets and, rewrite other people's works to get kind of in their head and feel the rhythm of their speech. That's all game if you're in the poetry line. Yeah, it's already a dodgy thing, so why not go all out?
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's been an inspiring journey. I think, well, I had more questions and a lot more, but I think in 2 hours we'll stay for this for now. And I think will be probably the principal. I probably will come back to you when you have the book, and I think we'll continue talking about this. So I'll put notes about a lot of your work and as well United Nations Sustainable Goals and all the different things about the as well the UN Sustainable Fashion Platform. So I don't know if you want to just last note or something where people can find some of your writings or some of the things at the moment, or they have to wait for the book, and we'll finish.
Yeah, I'm Michael Stanley-Jones on LinkedIn, Michael S. Jones on Facebook. Where you can go for more about fashion is the unfashionalliance.org, which doesn't mean unfashionalliance.org, but it sounds like that. And there you'll find some information about our work as an alliance. Other than that, you're welcome to write to me. I love to correspond with people and share ideas, especially about poetry, because that's really fun. People are asking me, did you really do that? And I say, no, that's just a character in a poem. And I have to explain to them the difference between the author and the character. But it's a lot of fun. And you're welcome to write to me. It's just my name at un.org. So there's a hyphen in Stanley-Jones. Don't forget the hyphen. Otherwise, you'll end up with some preacher in Kansas. No?
Well, Michael, it's been an honor and a very big privilege. Thank you for sharing your time with us. I think we will continue talking and appreciate, and I think all our audience will appreciate this special moment. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks all to your crew and your producer for making this happen.